Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're taking another look at the upcoming historical 4X game from Amplitude Studios, Humankind. As they continue to reveal more eras and cultures that will be part of the game at launch, and as I continue to make historical coverage about these eras, albeit with some recent delays, the developers went ahead and created a set of scenarios centered around various aspects of gameplay, and gave access to a bunch of people through their OpenDev concept in order to obtain some feedback and make adjustments accordingly. I was fortunate to be one of the folks involved in the process, and I'm really excited to see how things evolve afterward, but today I'm here to share with you everything I felt was noteworthy in the game, at least in its current state. Please keep in mind, this is a pre-alpha build that you're watching footage from. That means that everything from stats and descriptors can change, right up to any of the visuals you're seeing, such as the animations, the models, textures, etc. Again, this is pre-alpha footage, so take everything you see with a grain of salt. Now, over the course of 3 weekends, we were able to participate in some basic city management, some interesting battle scenarios, and a prolonged settlement defense. Through these scenarios, I found myself getting even more excited for Humankind than I already was. So, without any further delay, let's dive right in. Massive battles. The first pleasant surprise worth pointing out is the sheer scale of some of these battles, in terms of the number of units that get involved, the geography, and the time commitment they require. Multiple stacks of armies can be involved in a single battle, and the number of units involved seems to have a direct correlation to the length of the battle, with larger battles split over multiple turns with 5 rounds each, meaning you'll have to play your rounds while also doing your other empire management stuff per turn. This means that units that were being sent to a certain location on the map might get intercepted and engaged for multiple turns, fighting it out as the world moves on. When the engagement begins, a region of the map is carved out and used as the battlefield. The size of this region seems to be determined by a few factors, with technology being a primary element of consideration. A battle that involves artillery takes up a large amount of space in order to allow the proper use of the long range, for example. When a city is attacked, the entire area of the city becomes part of the battlefield, alongside a few hexes outside of it on all sides, allowing the attackers to make their approach from different angles. These large battles and battlefields will make for an interesting change of pace, and it really elevates the battles typical to these games to a higher, more involved level. Setting the battlefield. The first order of business when it comes time to engaging in combat was shown off best in the scenario that has us leading the Persians against the Greeks. With an army of immortals and another of cavalry to starting an engagement is up to us, and sending one of our units or one of our armies into one of the enemies is all it takes. However, the direction of this initial engagement and the setup before the engagement begins can make all the difference in the world for any field battle. Siege battles are different, and we'll discuss them shortly. The angle of engagement will determine the two halves of the battlefield, which faction deploys on which side, and as a result, what terrain each side will have easier access to, and what terrain will act as a part of the battlefield itself, sometimes cutting off or including essential access points. This also determines where the defender's flag is placed. This flag acts as an alternate way of winning a battle, and from my understanding, the attacker can choose to either wipe out the defender's units or capture the tile with the flag in order to win, though I haven't personally won by doing the latter yet. Both sides will get the opportunity to deploy troops on their own side, with the attacker deploying first. During this deployment, any other armies that were within the battlefield at the start of the engagement can be deployed too. Any that aren't deployed in this phase can be spawned later from where that army was standing on the campaign map, which is now a part of the battlefield. This allows for some great flanking maneuvers, but it also has a major weakness. Should an enemy unit occupy the hex, reinforcements won't be able to spawn until the hex is cleared. The use of high ground is crucial in this scenario, as the Persian immortals are extremely strong with an extra bonus from the high ground, but they're easily destroyed without that advantage, so Securing all the nearby high ground right at the start of the battle, and even before the start of the battle, helped bring success more easily. This is a level of strategy I was not expecting from the game whatsoever, and it was a pleasure to see. Another example of the importance of setting up the battlefield came with leading the Norsemen into siege against the Franks at Paris. Rather than immediately jumping into battle, setting reinforcements to approach the city from multiple sides allows the Norsemen to get the high ground from within the city walls, forcing the Franks to fight at a disadvantage. This, again, really shows the importance of setting up the battlefield during and before the battle, especially when you start to seriously consider the value of terrain and modifiers. As is always the case with games like this, modifiers come in a variety of forms and are always an essential factor when it comes to battles and each individual unit's attacks and defenses. Terrain plays a major part of this for all units, and at times, units are able to take an extra advantage of terrain on top of said baseline generic modifiers, but we'll touch more on that in just a bit. Height advantages, as you can imagine, are a constant concern. Attacking from or defending the high ground gives a significant buff. Engaging while standing on a river tile, meanwhile, gives a considerable debuff both while attacking and defending. Forests provide reasonable protection from ranged fire, but do nothing in melee. Terrain also changes how easily units are able to move around, and how far they're able to travel in a given turn. Now, it's important to note, crossing a river will take a lot of time. You have to move into the river, then you have to move off of it to ford it. Ridges and cliff sides prevent access to certain areas, and they open up the option of setting up choke points, and this applies even before battle begins, picking and choosing where to stand and how to engage to make sure you're able to take advantage of such circumstances, as we discussed previously. On top of this all, terrain also applies line of sight rules, and I don't just mean gunner units needing a clear line of sight in order to attack an enemy unit, but I mean in terms of hiding units and setting up ambushes, or finding yourself in an unexpected ambush. It definitely opens up a lot of tactical options. Since battles in Humankind span over several tiles with the point of engagement simply being the epicenter, terrain is as much of a consideration here as a game like XCOM or Age of Wonders. But the key difference is that here you know what you're getting into, and much like a real army would, you can choose the ground to fight on after considering how the terrain will give you benefits or penalties. For those of you who feel this is a little familiar, yes, that's because Amplitude has previously done this with Endless Legend as well. There are other modifiers as well that are fairly situational, and that can change how any individual engagement within a battle turns out. Flanking an enemy unit, that is, coming at it from one side while a friendly unit occupies the mirrored opposite side as well, will confer a large flanking bonus when attacking. A damaged unit will perform weaker while attacking or defending, with heavier damage causing a more significant penalty. If fighting within a city's reaches, there might be certain quarters that have been built that provide bonuses across the battlefield, and in some field and city battles, tiles where specific quarters have been built can be occupied by either side of a battle to take advantage of bonuses it gives on said tile. Units defending a siege while standing on a tile with walls will get a huge defensive bonus against attackers on the other side of the wall, and I'm sure there are many other modifiers out there that are yet to be discovered and explored, and maybe even some that slipped by me during these OpenDev scenarios. The scenario where the player leads a rather paltry force of Japanese soldiers against a Korean onslaught is an excellent example of how good use of terrain can absolutely obliterate numerical superiority, and how holding the high ground, mixed with a bit of patience, can act as a serious force multiplier. But what is the baseline force that's being multiplied? Well, for that we turn to the unit stats. Humankind doesn't look to overcomplicate unit stats. There are 4 stats for any unit: combat strength, movement, range, and veterancy. These are all fairly familiar terms to veterans of games like this, but I wanted to highlight them and also show the stats across all the units we were able to see in the OpenDev builds. These numbers are of course subject to change, so again, take them with a grain of salt. Combat strength determines how well a unit will perform, both offensively and defensively when engaged. It acts as the single number that helps calculate the damage a unit will both take and deliver, and it's used to calculate the balance of an engagement, which unit is superior and which is weaker. Almost all of the aforementioned modifiers primarily stack onto or take away from combat strength. The unit stat is just the baseline on top of which the modifiers are applied, which means that some units will always be poor combatants against others, while others are more likely to shine in combat regardless of circumstances. Movement determines movement, not just on the campaign map, but also in battle. How far a unit can go, taking into account difficult terrain they have to traverse through, slowing them down. Traversing elevation changes costs points, for example, and going into a river tile or trying to get out of a river tile costs extra points as well, and crossing fortifications into a city drains all movement points in one go. Range is self-explanatory, determining how close a target needs to be before it can be hit, but keep in mind that some units need to worry about line of sight as well, and they need to be appropriately positioned. Humankind quite kindly highlights in red the potential targets from any end destination, allowing you to get a quick read easily. Finally, veterancy is obtained through combat, and it seems to be specifically through dealing damage, and veterancy acts as another modifier on top of others while engaging in combat. There's a stat not shown on the unit card when recruiting, but that's because it's a generic stat, and that's health. All units have a pool of 100 health, and when the number hits 0, a unit dies. Any unit that dies in battle dies on the campaign map as well, but any unit that survives, even with a sliver of health, will be able to replenish. Unit traits and abilities. Beyond stats, units have traits and abilities that further impact their behavior both on and off the battlefield. Initially, when I saw each culture receive just the one unique unit, I was a little concerned at the depth of implementation we might see, but now that I've had the chance to play with some of these unique units under various circumstances, I'm feeling a lot better here. The impact here is hard to encompass in a single sentence. Simply put, they confer advantages and disadvantages to units on and off the battlefield. But that sounds kind of bland compared to what it actually does. Take, for instance, the Greek hoplite, or the hoplite, if you will. When standing side by side, they take advantage of the phalanx bonus, and that stacks if more units are side by side, as long as they all have that phalanx trait. This means there is a specific way to play the unit to get the most out of it. The Persian Immortal gets an extra bonus from the Bastion trait when attacking from high ground or from fortified positions, making it significantly more powerful in those circumstances. There are some traits, meanwhile, that apply on the campaign map. For example, Honor will prevent a unit from retreating from a battle, no matter the odds. Other traits and abilities will impact enemy units. The Hittite Gigir, for example, has suppression, allowing it to target an enemy unit that can, as a result of being attacked, only choose to move or attack in its next turn, not being able to do both. Meanwhile, the Egyptian Markabat is able to move after making an attack, where typically units end their round after making an attack. So even though we have two chariots here, they're tactically different, and not just because one is ranged and the other is melee, of course. These traits and abilities aren't exclusive to unique units either. Knights, for example, are able to charge to get a bonus to combat strength as long as they don't start the round adjacent to an enemy. But the unique Frankish equivalent unit packs an extra punch under similar circumstances. Ranged units suffer a penalty in melee, though gunners, which includes crossbowmen, are free from that penalty, and some units are anti-cavalry, getting an extra bonus when going up against, you guessed it, cavalry. Unit traits and abilities help ensure that each unit goes beyond its numbers and further amplifies the need and impact of terrain, positioning, deployment, and other battle circumstances that help breathe an extra bit of life to this aspect of the game. Sieges. Sieges are a unique beast that we touched on briefly earlier, but definitely needs some special attention here. When an attacker tries to enter a tile that a city is currently exploiting, the city is put under siege. I assume this only happens if a type of wall has been built, but that is just an assumption. Once a siege starts, there are a few things that happen and a few things that can happen next. The defender immediately gets access to a handful of home guard units. These change depending on the era, with the classical era citizen being replaced by the medieval era peasant. They're very low quality troops, but they help in a pinch. These home guard units are added to the defender's army alongside any other armies that are within the battlefield, including those that are stationed inside the city itself. But the fighting doesn't start right away. The attacker needs to build siege equipment, and different siege equipment becomes available through technology, from battering rams to ballistae to trebuchet to different things in later eras, I'm sure. Siege equipment takes time to build, and it can make a huge difference, helping destroy walls and the defensive bonuses they provide, and later eliminating or at least damaging enemy units. Siege equipment cannot be built in advance, and instead has to be built by the besieging army after the siege starts. As the attacking army is going through multiple turns building their siege equipment, both sides are able to send in reinforcing armies, and the defender loses one of its home guard units as well. And the defender also takes a hit to stability on the campaign level too. Both of these are part of the incentive for sallying forth earlier rather than later. Once siege equipment is ready, the attacker can choose to attack whenever, waiting to build more if the option is available, or kicking off the assault and starting a battle much like the others described earlier, though integrating bonuses from fortifications, orders, and the other factors we discussed earlier too. This heavily involved approach to city battles is an important reason to really consider your positioning when you establish and develop cities, and it makes the whole process feel a lot more integrated and interesting. And there's a whole resulting process of building for battle. There are a few things to consider when preparing for battle. Naturally, certain units need access to certain resources if they're to be recruited. This involves building mines, building farms of certain types, getting access to horses, what have you. You can also build certain buildings that act as alternate spawn points for units when they're recruited. For example, the English stronghold. Some structures provide bonuses to units in battle when occupied, but can be occupied by either side of the battle, while other structures provide bonuses to units that are adjacent, and these structures can sometimes be upgraded using other structures, like watchtowers amplifying castles. There are also some quarters that give a bonus to range for ranged units, allowing them to cause damage sooner in a battle because they're able to fire further down the line. Now, unfortunately, since these were fairly limited scenarios, I wasn't able to get too much information about other buildings that helped directly in battles, but there were some buildings that helped in other ways, like assisting in gaining veterancy. All of this was revealed by the tech tree. Divided into eras, the tech tree we were able to see only went up to the medieval era and showed how the eras intertwine. The final scenario started with the research on heavy infantry that allows the player to upgrade swordsmen to heavy infantry for a fee in gold. But, looking back at the ancient era onwards, we can see how the tech tree works and what it does. Just as a reminder, eras themselves are not unlocked through technologies, but by acquiring era stars, something I talk more about in the video I've linked in the description, pinned comment, and under the eye at the top right corner of the screen. So check that out for more information, not just about era stars, but Humankind in general. The tech tree is pretty simple and familiar in its functionality, and it unlocks everything from units to quarters and buildings to resources, both luxury and strategic, all the way to mechanics. For example, I'd briefly talked about battle reinforcements earlier in the video. Seems that option isn't actually available until you research the appropriate technology for it. Tech also allows you to have larger armies, meaning larger engagements, and it increases the efficiency of certain actions too. Now, it's possible that this isn't the entirety of the tech tree up to the medieval era either, and Maybe there are some blank spaces in here and some more ideas that are yet to be explored by the developers. So yet again, as with everything else in this video, do take it with a grain of salt. I just thought it would be interesting to share, and I feel like many folks would be interested in seeing this tech tree, where it is right now, how it stands, how it evolves, and how it expands. I'm personally curious to see what else the tech tree explores further down the line, and even in these eras themselves. But on the topic of exploration, this is where our exploration of Humankind comes to an end, at least today. OpenDev is a great idea for a game like this, despite its risks and the fact that it opens the devs up to a lot of potential backlash, showcasing a game this early in its dev cycle. Again, it's pre-alpha. With that said, again, this might be a pre-alpha, but things are already feeling pretty good, and these scenarios have done an excellent job of highlighting key concepts that are likely to remain notionally similar right up until release, with, balance and tweaks and adjustments here and there, of course, but overall, the core is looking very promising. Humankind is distinguishing itself from its competitors, and it's adding the Amplitude spin on a genre that has really needed a refreshing energy for a while. It's great to see some legitimate and viable competition in this space that can only be good for us as the people that are playing these games, seeing new ideas being brought into the space. Now, it's obviously way too early to make any judgment calls, but I think it's fair to say that Humankind is carving a nice, unique space for itself. I was frankly blown away with how involved the battles got, and it really opens one's eyes to how every little decision makes a big difference down the line. I'm really excited to see how all these things come together in the full game when you're able to build your own cities, position your own troops, all that kind of stuff without having these scenarios locking you in a certain place. It'll really all come together, well, hopefully it'll all come together nicely when these strategic decisions become so very important and integral down the line as things get more involved, as new technologies come through. It's going to be very interesting to see what comes next. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it gave you some insights into what's coming with Humankind. If you have any thoughts or questions, drop them in the comments down below. I read through all of the comments, and it really lets me know what I should look to answer for the community when the opportunity comes. Knowing what you're curious about, what you're wondering about, lets me know what I should maybe focus on if I get access or when I get the opportunity to speak to the developers, whatever it might be. So do let me know down below. And of course, if you're interested in seeing more coverage of Humankind and other strategy games, don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel either. As always, a massive thanks goes out to all of my channel members and patrons for supporting the channel on a monthly basis. That'll keep us alive and running smoothly. And of course, a big old thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.